It was a normal Monday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk and eating lunch. My office was quiet. Most people were still in the meeting room. Then my phone suddenly rang. I looked at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. There were only 5 words. "Are you still working there?" I stared at the message. I knew that number. My heart stopped for a second. It was Daniel, my ex-boyfriend. I had not seen him for 3 years. 3 years ago, Daniel got a new job in another city. It was a great job. It was everything he wanted. I was happy for him. But I was also afraid. One night, we sat in a small restaurant near my home. I still remember that night. I asked him, "What about us?" He looked at me and said, "I need this job." I asked, "And what about me?" He held my hand. "I will come back," he said. I believed him, I really did. But after he left, things slowly changed. His calls became shorter. His messages became fewer. Sometimes I waited all night for his reply. Then one day he called me. His voice was very quiet. "Maybe we should stop," he said. I did not understand. Stop what? Us. That was all. 3 years had passed since that day. I thought I had forgotten him. I was wrong. I looked at his message again. My fingers stayed above the screen. I wanted to ask him many questions. Why did you come back? Why now? Why did you look for me? But I sent nothing. I put my phone down and went back to work. At least, I tried to. The next morning, I walked out of my office at noon. Then I saw a man standing across the street. He was wearing a dark coat. He looked older than I remembered, but I knew him immediately. Daniel. He saw me too. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then he walked toward me. He stopped in front of me. "Hi," he said. I looked at him. My heart was beating very fast, but I did not smile. I only asked, "Why are you here?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I came back." 3 simple words. But they brought back 3 years of memories. I wondered, what did he really come back for? Daniel asked me to have coffee with him. I almost said no. But in the end, I went. We met at a small coffee shop near my office. It was the same place we used to visit 3 years ago. I sat across from him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. "You look different," he said. I smiled too. "So do you." He laughed softly. The waiter brought our coffee. I looked down at my cup. I did not know what to say. Daniel finally broke the silence. "How have you been?" "I'm good," I said. He nodded. "I'm glad." I looked at him. "You?" "I'm good too." He told me about his life. He had changed jobs. He had moved back to the city. His work was going well. He finally had a good apartment. He finally had time. Then he looked at me. "I have everything I wanted now," he said. I did not answer. 3 years ago, he also wanted everything. A better job, more money, a better life. But he did not have time for me. Now he had time. But I was no longer waiting for him. Daniel looked at me. "I thought about you a lot." I tried to stay calm. "Why?" He looked down at his coffee. "Because I missed you." My heart moved a little. I hated that. I had spent 3 years learning how to live without him. And now one sentence could still hurt me. Before I could answer, the door opened. A man walked into the coffee shop. It was Leo. He saw me and smiled. "Sorry, am I late?" I shook my head. "No, you're fine." Leo sat beside me. He looked at Daniel. I introduced them. "This is Daniel. We used to work together." I did not say he was my ex-boyfriend. Leo smiled and held out his hand. "Nice to meet you." Daniel shook his hand. "Nice to meet you too." Leo looked at me. "Did you eat?" I smiled. "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Yes." He laughed. You always say yes. I looked at him and smiled. It was a small moment, but I noticed Daniel was very quiet. A few minutes later, Leo and I left the coffee shop. When we reached the street, I looked back. Daniel was still sitting there, alone. He was looking at us through the window. For some reason, I felt sad. I did not want to feel sad. That night, I stood in front of my bedroom window. I thought about Daniel. Then I thought about Leo. 3 years ago, I had waited for Daniel. Now, someone else was waiting for me. And suddenly, I understood something painful. Daniel had not come back too late. He had come back at exactly the wrong time, because I had already learned how to live without him. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling. I kept thinking about Daniel. I was angry with myself. Why did I still care about him? 3 years had passed. I had a new job. I had new friends. I had a new life. I thought I had moved on. But one meeting with Daniel brought back so many memories. I picked up my phone. I opened our old photos. There was one from 3 years ago. We were standing near a lake. Daniel was smiling. I was holding his arm. We looked happy. I smiled at the photo. Then I remembered that day. It was the day before he left. He held my hand and said, "I will come back." I believed him. After he left, I waited. At first, he called me every night. Then he became busy. His calls became shorter. Sometimes he did not call for days. I always found a reason for him. He is busy. He is tired. He needs time. I told myself these things again and again. Then my mother got sick. I was scared. I wanted Daniel beside me. I called him that night. He answered after a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm at work." I tried not to cry. "I need you." There was silence. Then he said, "I know." But he did not come. That night I stayed alone in the hospital. I looked at my phone many times. No new messages. The next morning I received one. "Sorry, I was very busy." That was all. I put my phone away. Something changed inside me that day. I stopped waiting. I stopped asking when he would come back. I started taking care of my own life. 3 years later, Daniel was standing in front of me again. He said, "I never stopped loving you." I looked at him. My heart was quiet this time. I asked, "Then why did you leave?" He did not answer. He looked down. I already knew the answer. He wanted a better life. And I was not part of that plan. I took a deep breath. "Daniel, I loved you very much." He looked at me. "I know. But I needed you 3 years ago." His eyes became red. "I know. You were not there." He stayed silent. I looked out of the window. For the first time, I did not want to make him feel better. I did not want to tell him that everything was okay, because it was not okay. Some pain does not disappear. It just becomes quiet. Before I left, Daniel asked, "Do you still love me?" I stopped at the door. I wanted to say no. It would have been easier. But I could not lie. "Yes," I said. His eyes filled with hope. Then I added, "But that does not mean I can go back." I walked away. Outside, the evening air was cold. I finally understood the truth. I still loved him, but love was no longer enough. 2 weeks passed after that night. I did not see Daniel again. I tried to forget our conversation, but I could not. Every time my phone rang, I looked at the screen. I hoped it was Daniel. Then I felt angry with myself. I had a good life now. Why was I still thinking about the past? Then there was Leo. He was kind to me. He always listened. He remembered small things about me. He knew when I was tired. He never asked me to change. We had been together for almost 2 years. We were planning to get married. But after Daniel came back, something changed inside me. One evening, Leo and I had dinner at home. He was cutting vegetables in the kitchen. I stood behind him for a long time. Finally, I said, "Leo, can we talk?" He stopped. He looked at me. "Of course." I sat down. My hands were shaking. I don't know what to do. Leo was quiet. Then he asked, "Is it because of Daniel?" I looked at him. I could not lie. "Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you still love him?" I didn't answer, but my silence was enough. Leo looked very sad. I started crying. "I'm sorry." He sat beside me. He did not get angry. He only said, "I knew you loved him." I looked at him in surprise. "You knew?" He smiled sadly. "Sometimes I saw it in your eyes." My heart hurt. "I love you too," I said. "I know," he answered, "but I don't know if I can forget him." "You should not marry me if you cannot." His words broke my heart. The next morning I called off the wedding. I thought Leo would hate me. He did not. He only said, "Go and find the answer." A few days later, Daniel came to see me. He stood outside my apartment. He looked nervous. "Can we talk?" I let him in. He looked at me and said, "I want you back." I took a deep breath. "Daniel, what happens when life becomes hard again?" "I will stay." "How do I know?" He was silent. I continued, "You said the same thing 3 years ago." He looked down. This time he did not try to explain. He only said, "I know." Then he looked at me. "I cannot change the past, but I can change what I do now." I did not give him an answer. Not that day. Because I had finally learned something. I did not need a man to come back and save me. I needed to know if he could stay. And this time I would not choose him because I was afraid of losing him. I would choose him only if I could trust him again. 6 months passed. A lot changed during those 6 months. I did not get back together with Daniel right away. We started slowly. We met for coffee. We went for walks. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we said nothing. I wanted to know who he was now. Not the man I remembered from 3 years ago. The real Daniel. He also wanted to know who I had become. One Saturday morning he came to my apartment. He brought 2 cups of coffee. "You still like this one?" he asked. I smiled. "Yes." He smiled too. We sat by the window. There was no big plan, no promise, just 2 people trying to understand each other again. One evening we went for a walk in the park. The weather was cool, the streets were quiet. Daniel suddenly stopped. He looked at me. "Do you regret meeting me again?" I thought for a moment. "Sometimes." He smiled sadly. "Why?" "Because you made me remember how much I loved you." He looked down. Then he asked, "Do you still love me?" I looked at him. "Yes." His eyes became bright. But before he could say anything, I continued. "But things are different now." He nodded. "I know." I took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I waited for you every day. He looked at me quietly. "I waited for your calls. I waited for your messages. I waited for you to come back." "I know," he said. "But I don't wait anymore." He looked confused. "Then why are you still here?" I smiled. "Because now I choose you." He did not say anything. He just took my hand. His hand was warm. For the first time, I did not feel afraid. We did not get married that year. We did not make big promises. We simply stayed together. We learned how to talk. We learned how to listen. We learned how to stay when life became difficult. 1 year later, we were walking home after dinner. Daniel suddenly asked, "Do you remember the first time we met again?" I laughed. "Yes." "You looked so angry." I was angry. He smiled. Then I looked at him. "Do you remember what I asked you?" He thought for a moment. Why are you here? I nodded. And now? He looked at me. Now I know. He held my hand. I'm here because I love you. I smiled. 3 years ago, I loved Daniel, so I waited for him. 3 years later, I still loved him. But I no longer waited. I chose him. That was the difference. Love is not always about waiting for someone to come back. Sometimes love means finding yourself first. And when that person comes back, you can choose again. Not because you are lonely. Not because you are afraid. But because you truly want to be together. And this time, we both chose each other.